Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. OnTarget HTML5 is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll also be adding a JavaScript section to the website over the next few months. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Welcome to Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we'll be talking about working with variables in ActionScript 3. So variables in ActionScript 3. In this tutorial we're going to discuss variables. The basic syntax and structure of the code will be demonstrated as we work through the tutorial demonstrations. A variable is a container that holds pieces of information for our application that can be recalled at any later time. Said another way, variables allow you to store and retrieve data inside your programs as they're executing. A variable is a representation of a number, a string of characters, or some other value that can change values during the execution of the application. In ActionScript 3, variables contain chunks of information known as objects for the time during which your program is running. Variables are used in almost every aspect of programming. You may also hear variables referred to as properties when they're part of a class. If you have any questions on something that I discussed during the tutorial, feel free to email me and ask the question. I am open to any questions during these tutorials. And again, there's links located throughout the website if you have any questions or you want some additional information. So the basic syntax for a variable. We start out, and we went through this when we did this introduction a few tutorials ago, but I told you that we start out with a var. Then we give the variable name, and in this case it's units. Then I have a colon. Then I assign the data type of the variable. In this case it's a number. And then I assign it a value. In this case it's going to equal 30. And remember, the variable keyword var in ActionScript, it's required that variables be declared. In ActionScript 2 and earlier it wasn't, but now in ActionScript 3 it's required that we declare these variables. Units, the name we've given our variable. This can be any name of your choosing, but following proper naming conventions. We talked about those in the last tutorial. It's highly recommended the variable name is followed by a colon. So we give that variable name, then we send it with a colon, and then we assign a data type. The data type of the variable. There are numerous different data types of variables that we can use throughout ActionScript, and you're going to see those in a minute. We'll cover most of them as we go through these tutorials. The data types that we'll be discussing are number, any number including floating point values, int, any integer or whole number, and I'm going to have some demonstrations of both of these inside the demonstration, inside the lab, uint, unsigned integers or any non-negative whole number. Then we have strings, which is text or a string of characters, always enclosed in quotation marks. Then we have Boolean, which is true or false values, and we also have arrays. And arrays are variables that contain more than a single variable value. And you're going to see a lot of demonstrations of arrays as we start working through the exercises. And then objects, the basic structure of every ActionScript entity, but also a custom form that can be used to store multiple values as an alternative to an array. And you'll see some demonstrations of those as we get later on in the tutorial series. So again, the basic syntax of the variable. Going back to the last thing we didn't talk about, that assignment operator 30, that's the initial value that we've assigned to the variable. This is optional because variables can be declared in ActionScript 3 with no initial value set, and you're going to see that as we go through the lab also. So one thing I want to clarify, in previous versions of ActionScript, declaring and typing variables was optional. However, in ActionScript 3, this practice is required. This may at first seem like a step backwards in your programming skills, but this will become second nature as we move through the tutorials. This has always been a best practice in programming, and even in previous versions of ActionScript it was a best practice to declare the variables and data type it. As you develop your programming skills, you'll begin to appreciate the error checking and feedback that this practice provides. By data typing and declaring variables, you actually get additional feedback in your debugging tools that allow you to more quickly isolate problems inside your programming code. So let's move into our development environment and work through some exercises on variables in ActionScript 3. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize our presentation and drop down into our development environment. Let's go ahead and bring up Flash, and I've got my standard Flash screen like you've seen in the past tutorials. I have my branding layer, which is locked. I've explained how we're going to be using that. That just actually brands it as a non-target HTML5 tutorial. So the first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and demonstrate inside our action panel how we're going to be using variables. So I'm starting out with this flash start file. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I want to save that as because I don't want to overwrite our start file. Let's go ahead and set and save as flash _1003_1. And again, you'll be able to get a finished copy of this file if you have access to the exercise files, which will have all the code that we demonstrate throughout these tutorials. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a layer to our timeline. I'm going to go ahead and select that branding layer, right click and insert a layer. And right above that layer, I'm going to put in actions. Everything that we do in this particular tutorial is going to be demonstrated in the actions panel and the output panel. We're not going to be doing anything actually on the stage itself as we go through these demonstrations. I'm going to go ahead and select frame 1. I want to open up my actions panel. Again, we can do that with F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Macintosh. Keeping in mind I've got my action panel docked on my right-hand toolbar. Same thing with my output panel is right below it. So we'll be going back and forth between those two. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and put my stop, as I do with all my demonstrations in ActionScript. I'm going to put a stop here so we stop any animation that may occur on the timeline. Don't have that problem right now because we have nothing else on the timeline, but it's a good habit to get into. I'm going to declare my first variable, and I'm going to name this variable units, and I want to data type it with number. And then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. And the first thing I want you to notice here is, okay, we've declared the variable, we've given the variable a name, I've given it a data type and number, but I've made no assignment to this particular variable. So if I were to save this change and I were to test this movie in my output panel, but using Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac, you'll notice I have nothing in the output panel. There's nothing there. And the reason there's nothing there, because there's my output panel, because I haven't assigned anything to that number variable. So what I can do, I can come on down here and actually give that an assignment. So let's come down here and say units equals, and let's give it an assignment of 30 for this particular demonstration, then come right down below this and say trace units. And again, the only reason we're using that trace statement is it allows us to actually output this display to the output panel. Without a trace statement, we have no idea what's going on because we can't see what's actually occurring in our code. Let's go ahead and save that change. Let's go ahead and do our test movie, Control Enter on Windows, Command Return on the Mac. And this time you notice we see that 30 inside of our output panel. And the reason we're seeing that 30, what I want to do is let's go ahead and undock these. I don't want to have these together. So I can actually have my action panel up in one area. Let's go ahead and move this over here. Go ahead and resize this window a little bit because we don't quite need it this big. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring out my output panel and I'm going to have it over here. So this way you can see the output panel and the code that we're using. Let me go ahead and bring this into our development environment. This way you have a view of the output panel and you'll have a view of the action panel. Okay, so we've actually displayed that 30 now. So we've declared a variable, we've data typed it as a number, we've assigned a value to the variable, and then we've traced it to our screen. If I were to take out the assignment as we've done before and trace units, let's go ahead and save that change. Test our movie, Control Enter Window, Command Return to the Mac. You'll notice we get NaN, which is not a number. So it's telling us through our error coding that we don't have any value or we don't have a number value assigned to that unit's variable. And by tracing that, we're actually seeing that in the output panel that there's no assignment to it. So we know that now with numbers, they store numeric values, negative, positive, and decimal. The int allows any whole number value. Strings store of text enclosed in quotation marks. Single or double. Quotes can be used, but we got to be consistent. So if we start with a double, we want to end with a double. We start with a single, we want to end with a single. Boolean values can store true or false. And we always want to end our statements with this semicolon. Very, very important. So, okay, let's come down here. Let's assign units a value like we'd done before. Let's say 13. But up here, I want to say units number equal 30. Let's save our changes to the code and let's talk about what we've just done. So I've initiated a value variable called units. I've data typed it as a number and I've given it a value of 30. And then right below that line of code, I'm reassigning a new value. And this is what you see a lot inside of our programming, a new value to the value units. So if I were to put a trace statement here, what I should see in my output panel is my first trace, I should have the value of 30. And then since I've made a new assignment to the units variable, my second trace statement should show me a value of 13. So let's go ahead and test the movie. Control Enter in Window, Command Return to the Mac. And you notice in our output panel now we're seeing both the trace here where we have 30 in the units variable, and then we've reassigned the value of the units variable to 13. And now when we trace it out, you'll see that that value is now 13 that's being stored inside that units variable. Okay, so we've seen how we can play around with the number data type. Let's look at a different type of variable. I'm going to go ahead and rem this out so that this actually becomes part of this file. If you have access to the exercise files, you'll actually still have this in there. Let's go ahead and look at a different type of variable. So I'm going to create another variable. We'll call it units again. But I'm going to data type this one as an integer, int. And I'm going to give it a value of 6.2. And then I'm going to end that with a semicolon. And if you remember correctly from our discussion, the integer values inside of our variables, it stores whole numbers, allows any whole number value. So just based on the fact that we've given this an assignment or a data type of integer, should tell you what's going to be traced out. So let's go ahead and trace units. Let's go ahead and save those changes and test our movie in the window. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return to the Mac. This time you'll notice we're only seeing the value 6 because as an integer data type, it only stores whole numbers. So if I were, and it doesn't round them by the way either. If I were to make this 6.9 and save that change, it's still going to store, test the movie, it's still going to store the value 6. It's actually disregarding everything that's after that decimal point. This may seem goofy, but believe it or not, these come in very, very handy when we're counting things in databases and as we're doing programming counts, that we drop off those decimals. So it's a very handy feature inside programming to be using integer data types. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's look at another value in a variable. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out. So again, this becomes part of the exercise files. Now let's look at a data type of string. So I'm going to declare another variable. This one I'm going to call first name. And again, you'll notice I use camel case, small letter for the first word, for first, and then a capital N for the second word inside my variable name. I'm going to data type this as a string, and this is going to be equal to John. And I've got that enclosed in double quotation marks. So now we're looking at a completely different data type. I want to trace this to our output panel. And I'm sure you understand the reason that we're tracing this to the output panel is so that you can actually see what's going on in the program. Since we're not actually writing a true application, we have nothing to appear on the stage, and the only way we can see what's occurring is inside of our output panel inside of ActionScript. So then I want to trace first name, again, enclosed in parentheses, save those changes, test our movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return to the Mac, and now you see that we've got John in our output panel. Because again, that's what we traced to that variable. We assigned it the name John. So if I were to come up here and make this Mike, let's put this in single quotes because both will work, single or double quotes, but we need to be consistent as to how we do this. Normally I use double quotes. It's just become a best practice for me to use double quotes because a lot of times, especially when I'm working with PHP, when I'm intermixing HTML and programming code, HTML requires some things to be in double quotes, so I tend to use double quotes for all my text files or my text strings as I assign them to variables. Let's go ahead and save that. Go ahead and test it in our browser window. Control Enter Windows, Command Return to the Mac, and you'll notice now we've traced Mike to our output panel. And again, this time I use single quotes, but it's my practice. Whenever I'm enclosing strings in ActionScript, I always use my double quotes instead of the single quotes. Let's go ahead and save that change. So let's look at something that's a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out. And the next thing I think we should look at is let's look at booleans. All right, so the next thing I want to look at Boolean variables. And again, Boolean variables are very, very popular in all programming languages because they give us a value of true or false. So I'm going to go ahead and assign a variable. I'm going to declare a variable. I want to call it present. And I want to data type this as Boolean. Something you should notice, by the way, when you get these data types correct, and actually when you get the terminology correct in ActionScript, you'll notice it's turning green. That lets you know that it is a reserved keyword inside of ActionScript. I want to give it an assignment of true, and then I want to trace present into our output panel, ending both statements with a semicolon. And again, remember, Boolean variables can only store the values true and false. We use a lot of Boolean variables when we're doing our loops and our if statements. Because if you remember, we talked about the if statement in the introduction tutorial. We actually have to evaluate whatever's between those parentheses has to be true in order to run the code that's between the curly braces. Well, this is where Booleans can come in quite handy as we're doing if statements inside of our code to actually trace through and look for that true or look through that false or not true inside of our conditional statements. So I'm going to go ahead and test this movie. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, and you notice I've got it true now in my output panel because my Boolean variable is storing that true. If I were to make this false, and you'll see a lot of demonstrations of this as we go through the programming of our conditional statements and loops. Now again, you'll see that we have that false value stored inside that present variable. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out so we can move on to the next demonstration, because next I want to show you a trick that I use. A lot of times when we're working with large programs, we'll have lots of variables that we'll need to declare at the very beginning of the code. So it's not unusual to save time to declare these all in a single line. And let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to make a variable declaration. I'm going to say breakfast. I want to data type that as a string. And then I want to give it an assignment of eggs. Now, knowing that I've got a lot of other variables that I want to declare inside this program, I'm just going to put in a comma, and I'm going to name my next variable, data type that as a string, and we're going to say that equals hamburger. And I'm just using goofy names for these variables just to walk through the demonstration. Put another comma, declare another variable, and let's say that that one's going to be a string also, because it's going to be a variable of dinner, and that's going to be equal to meatloaf. In quotation marks, put a comma. Let's declare one more variable, and we'll call it cash. I want to data type this one as a number. So again, I'm going to change the data type to number this time, and I'm going to give that an assignment of 100. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So what I've done here, inside this one variable declaration, I've actually declared 4 variables. I've got a variable breakfast that's a string that's eggs, lunch that's a string that's hamburger, dinner that's a string that's meatloaf, and cash that's data typed as a number and equals to 100. So what if I said trace, and the way we can group these, I can actually say breakfast, comma, lunch, comma, dinner, comma, cash, and my parentheses, and my statement with a semicolon. And when I execute this code, I should trace all 4 of those variables into my output panel. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Test our movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return on the Mac. And you'll notice now I've got all 4 of those variables declared in a single line that are now displaying in my output panel. But I don't have to call them all. I could just say trace cash, or trace lunch. And as long as I spell the variables correctly inside my trace statements, I can actually pick these out of this variable declaration and display them individually. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Test our movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And now you'll see that we've declared all 4 at the top. I've pulled out just the cash variable. I've pulled out just the hamburger variable or the lunch variable individually from that long string. It's not unusual when you have large programs that you may have 30 or 40 variables that you're declaring at the very beginning of the program as you set it up for execution, that you could actually declare these in 1 or 2 lines to make it just easier to enter your code. So if you were to see this happening, or if you see this in some of our demonstrations in future tutorials, understand that we're just declaring a group of variables together. Each variable has to have a name, and it has to have a data type. It doesn't have to have a value, but it does have to have a name. It does have to have a data type. They're separated by a colon, and they're separated individually by commas inside the long string. And then obviously at the very end of the declaration, we end it with a semicolon. Not that unusual. I do this quite frequently, and actually I could actually add to this if I wanted to declare another variable that had no value. I could say units, data type that as a number, and just leave it just like that, just like we had done before, but I need to spell number correctly, obviously. Now I've got another variable inside that string called units without a value assigned to it. I could assign the value down here, units equal cash. So what I've done is I've actually told my units variable that you're equal to whatever the value of the cash variable is. And then I could trace units. Save all those changes. Let's go back and test our movie. Control in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And now you'll notice after we trace out our lunch, I take the value from units, which is from units, which is 0 right now, and I say you're equal to the value of cash, which is 100, because that's where we've assigned that value right there. And now we've traced out units, and now units also equals 100. So there's a lot of different things you can do with variables, and as we start working through these tutorials, you're going to see we do a whole lot of stuff with these, and they're a very important part, a very important aspect of our programming. Let's go ahead and remark this out because I've got another demonstration I want to show you using our constant variables that we talked about at the very beginning of the tutorial series. All right, so the next one I want to demonstrate, let's go ahead and come down a few lines. The next one I want to demonstrate is I want to talk a little bit about the constant variables that we talked about in the very first tutorial, because there is a new variable inside of ActionScript 3 called a constant. So let me go ahead and set up a few different variables here. I'm going to set up a constant variable, and I'm going to call it tax rate. And this is going to be data typed as a number. And I want this to be equal to 0.052. And end that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to come down right below that and declare a variable called purchase price. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to set up a demonstration that you might actually see inside of a real program. I'm going to data type that as a number, and I'm going to make that equal to 7526 for this particular example. And that with a semicolon. Then I'm just going to come down a couple lines and I'm going to say I want you to trace, and this is where we start getting into the power of programming. I want you to take the purchase price value. So you're looking at that value that we have inside the purchase price, and I want you to multiply it by the tax rate. And again, that's enclosed in parentheses. That star sign you see there is multiplication in our programming code. It's called an operator. We're going to go through a lot of the different operators that are available inside of Flash and actually inside of most programming languages. So let's come down a couple lines. Let's go ahead and execute this code. So I'm going to do a Control Enter in Windows, Command Return on the Mac. And inside of our output panel, you'll see that we have 3.91. So what it's actually doing, it's actually figuring out the tax rate, $3.91. If I made a purchase of $75.26 with a tax rate of 5.2%, that would be $3.91, because obviously it's going to round down. It's going to drop off that 352. And there's actually ways that we can format this where we'd only see the 391, and we'll get into that as we get into future tutorials. But this is a way that we can actually really see this happen. Something that you might actually see happen inside of a real program. So if I came down here and said purchase price equals 121.50, and I copied, ending that with a semicolon, and I copied this line right here. I'm just going to do a Control-C to copy that and come right down below where we've reassigned the value of purchase price and paste it in there. Now we're going to recalculate that same value, that same variable, with a new value that we've assigned, because we've given purchase price now a new assignment of 121.50. So when we test this movie, we should actually see the 391 plus the tax rate for 121.50. So let's go ahead and test the movie. Control Enter Windows, Command Return in the Mac. So now you'll see that if we made the purchase at $75.26, the tax rate would be $391. If the purchase was $121.50, the tax rate would be $631, based on a 0.052% tax rate. And that's something you might actually see inside of a real program. It would actually take the variable from purchase price, which we may have inside of a shopping cart, or we may have it inside of a form, pull out that price, and then using the constant variable tax rate, make calculations on that price. that would be used later in the program when probably it was spitting out an invoice or printing or displaying an invoice or something like that along those lines. So constant variables are new to ActionScript 3. We're going to have some good demonstrations on those as we move through the future of the tutorials, because I've got some good things I want to demonstrate using constant variables, not only for numbers, but other things that we can use constant variables for. So I hope that made sense. I hope these were some pretty good, decent demonstrations. I want to go ahead and let's rem this out. I want to go ahead and save this file as our finished file for Flash 1003. That'll actually be the finished file for this particular tutorial series. So if you do have access to the exercise files, you'll have copies of all the code that we use for this and all the demonstrations. Now I want to go ahead and drop back into our presentation for a minute and just quickly review what we've covered in this tutorial. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of Flash. Let's get back into our presentation. And let's talk a little bit about, let's review some of the things that we talked about with the variables in ActionScript 3. So during this tutorial series, we discussed var, the keyword var, and how we use it to declare a variable inside of ActionScript, and the fact that in ActionScript 3 that is required. We now need to use that keyword var when we're declaring a variable. We looked at the constant variable keyword and how we can use constant variables inside of our ActionScript code and make assignments to those and use those to calculate other variables inside of our program. We looked at the trace statement and how using the trace statement will allow us to look at the output panel and see how our code is executing. You're going to see a lot more examples of traces as we start working through some of these exercises, and they get a little more complicated. We'll actually use trace statements to actually work our way through the code to make certain aspects or certain portions of the code are operating correctly. We talked about the importance of ending all of our statements with a semicolon. Very important in ActionScript. Whenever we finish a statement inside of our programming code, we end it with a semicolon. We looked at the number data type. We looked at the int data type, which is the integer data type. Remember, that's whole numbers. It's going to drop off anything after the decimal point. We looked at Boolean data types, and we also looked at one of the operators available in ActionScript called the star or asterisk, which is the multiplying operator, and it allows us to multiply the value of our variables. We're going to go over a lot more stuff as we start working through the other exercises, but based on this one tutorial, you should have a pretty good grasp now of variables, how we declare them, how we make assignments to them, and how we can change the assignments inside of our ActionScript code. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be notified of tutorials as they're posted. And don't forget to check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available for viewing. There's many more than we don't have posted up on YouTube. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting the OnTarget HTML5 YouTube channel.